Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here to our panel on neurodiversity, creativity and disability. Welcome to the WayWORD Festival and welcome virtually to Aberdeen. This festival is brought to you by the Word Centre for Creative Writing with the generous support of Creative Scotland and the University of Aberdeen. We are delighted to be able to have three wonderful speakers, artists here with us today. I'm Anya Larkin from the French department here at the University of Aberdeen. My co-chair for this panel is Samira Rauner. Samira, would you like to pop in here to wave?
Yeah.
Say hello. Samira and I will be managing the question and answer session after the presentations by our three artists today. So please, as the event is unfolding, if you have questions or comments that you'd like to put in the chat bar or into the Q&A box, then please do so, and Samira and I will keep an eye on that and put those questions or pass on your comments to our three artists. We're also delighted to have with us today Leslie Carrera to provide BSL, British Sign Language interpretation for us here today. So she should be visible to you throughout the event. We also have live captions. And if you want to enable closed captions so that you can see them at the bottom of your screen, you can just click on the CC button on your Zoom toolbar. So I will hand over now to Samira.
Okay, so just regarding the overall format of the event, as Anya mentioned, the first half is dedicated to the artists. So each of them will share some of their work with you, and then we will move on to the Q&A session. And as Anya mentioned, feel free to put questions into the chat or the Q&A box at any point, and we will get to them later on. So just briefly introducing Nuala before she's going to share some of her work with you. Nuala lives and works in Glasgow, and her poems have appeared in anthologies, including Stares and Whispers, D/Deaf and Disabled Writers Write Back, A Year of Scottish Poems, and To Mind Your Life, Poems for Nurses and Midwives. And Nuala's poems have also been broadcast on BBC Radio 3 and 4. And her current interests include visual impairment as a creative context and the relationship between disability and parenthood. So Nuala, take it away.
Hello, I'm a visually impaired poet, and because visual impairment has been used a lot as a symbol in poetry, both for a source of inspiration and also a symbol for incapacity. That's a challenge to visually impaired poets. Could I possibly have a shared screen showing poems? Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to look at three poems, two of which are by me. The first one is very famous. You may be familiar with it. It appears in just about every anthology of English poetry. And if you are a visually impaired poet, you have to find a way of coming to terms with it. On his blindness, when I consider how my light is spent ere half my days in this dark world and wide, and that one talent which is deaf to hide, lodged with me useless, though my mind more bent to serve therewith my Maker, and present my true account, lest he returning chide. Doth God exact day labour light denied, I fondly ask? But patience, to prevent that murmur, soon replies, God doth not need either man's work or his own gifts. Who best bear his mild joke, they serve him best. His state is kingly, thousands at his bidding speed, and post o'er land and ocean without rest. They also serve who only stand and wait. So my relationship with this poem is long-standing and complicated, and this is my version. On her partial blindness, When I consider how to represent my sixth of working light, my words collide with your fear of dark. Your visions hide the blindness born with me. You mourned sight sent before you into death. Let me invent a new account, half light to place beside your grief, the beauty of blind life denied. I'd rather exploration than lament sight as lost paradise. So my poems need to make a sense I'm neither banned nor blessed, but breathing here. I want to have my state revealed, so thousands at my bidding read as I eat, sleep, kiss, swear, get children dressed. I feel and write, I do not stand and wait. You'll notice that my sonnet is quite closely modelled on Milton. It's got the same rhyme scheme and indeed the same rhymes. And this is because I wanted to say that actually my perspective is equal to Milton's. He has a right to be in the canon, but so do I, and so do people like me. And also to present visual impairment as part of a rounded life rather than as a disaster. Milton's position, but it's a disaster, is rather complicated by the fact that he went and wrote this poem anyway. I think of poetry as a very long conversation between people who have fought using poems. It's fought TH, not fought F. I find this comforting. I imagine myself as part of a long company of people who have fought like this, but that means I get to talk to the others as well. If we can move on to the next page. Yep. When I was talking to Milton, I very carefully used his form to assert parity, but then I had to think about what kind of form could best represent the experience of visual impairment, because it might not be an exactly conventional sonnet of the type I've just shown you. And this is, I have realised that all three of these poems are about coming to terms with not being able to see. This poem is set up like a Snellen chart, which is for testing visual acuity, which means it starts off very big. The top T is font size 72, and the bottom couplet is font size 8. And as you go down the poem, the rhymes become more approximate, so that you gradually lose certainty. So the eye chart, I scowl towards his voice. He says the map marks how far vision goes. If I could creep up close, I'd learn the journey. His technique restricts me to a chair, so he can track how far I travel down the chart alone before I pause. I grope on the third line, my limit the next shape I recognise, then stop. No way. I still believe my eyes can hold a solar system, catch all lights, deliver to the doctor alphabets as small as atoms. But this world is smudge. I'm huddled at the bottom of the page, trying to hide my dark. Wherever I am, I've bypassed every symbol I can name and stumble at my vision's borders where letters are illegible as stars. And this is an attempt to catch the realization that you cannot see as well as you would like, and that you need to find a way of coming to terms with it. And it's it's a process I went through when I was much younger. Even if you have a congenital disability, you have to spend many years coming to terms with it. And you may not, that may continue for decades. I remember once saying to a a special educational needs teacher, I can see everything in this room, and I was too young to understand, but everything is a relative concept. I was, though, disturbed when this poem was used for National Poetry Day, and it was put on the 11 to 14 curriculum, and they asked questions about success and failure. I'm not sure that, you know, you can fail a Greek exam. I'm not sure that you can fail a visual acuity test. You just have to find a way of expressing that visual acuity. And I should probably stop now.
Thank you for sharing, Nuala. Next, Jill Boyd will share some of her art with you, and Jill uses her creative practice as a means to have a voice, and she describes herself as a mixed media visual artist working primarily with photography. And Jill completed her BA in Fine Arts in 1988 and is currently working towards an MA in photography in Leeds. And Jill was diagnosed as autistic later in life, and her latest work involves the use of text, pairing it with her images.
Hi, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. I want to say bear with. Right, I'm just trying to move people. Ah, there we are, present. Okay, I'm just moving this. Right, I now identify, can you hear me okay? Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Leslie. Yeah, it's been a journey for me, and yeah, I identify now with a hidden disability, now owning something that I didn't quite understand. My work, this is work that I've done before, and I always use my work as a way of having a voice or expressing difficulties and challenges and shouting sometimes about things that I find unfair, which I struggle with. This is how I presented to my GP what I felt like, and this is what it feels like to be autistic for me. I can't speak for other people. Everyone's experience is different. Because we come across so many different environments and experiences that can define how we view things. How I see stuff is really important and interesting for me. Linking with others, connections, and understanding those connections is been a theme of my work and my place with it. I use humour quite a lot in my work, which you'll see in a bit. So obviously this was very much a part of feeling like I wasn't really engaged, but it was all around me as well. Particularly as being a mum, I didn't feel there was a bond there until I decided and had some counselling that identified that I was good enough. I've tried to remember to smile because I find eye contact quite challenging. I've also got Erling's, which means that I have scotopic sensitivity syndrome, where the black on white on paper it moves about, but it also affects my environment a lot. I also have a physical disability now, and that's been a difficult journey. As Nuala said, it's just something to come to terms with, because I've always felt like this. I've always felt disconnected. I always felt like I didn't belong in my own family, and asked my mum quite often, was I adopted, because I couldn't quite connect. I'm going to just quickly read this because I think it's important to just show how difficult it's been to get to this point. I did wonder, why did I seek out a diagnosis, which did begin in 2016 in February? It was because I was sick of not having a clear reason as to why I was how I was. I was sick of pretending to be someone else, to function, adopting ways of others, to interact. I sort of gleaned, oh, that was a good way of dealing with something. And that included in films, television, and my observations. So I know I'm quite good at observing people and can mimic their mannerisms because I'm quite an expert in that. Then there was the struggle to be in a work environment, which was increasingly overwhelming due to the changes that were being implemented where I worked. I've worked there since 2011, and it was the longest employment I've ever had. Even as a psychiatric nurse in the past, I moved environments, which one could do. But my art technician workshop space was taken away from me, and I was not understood at work at all. I was completely lost. Therefore, I left. I had been waiting for an initial assessment appointment for a significant period. Then a letter arrived in April 2017, which explained that there was a waiting list delay. My GP said that the list had closed, and he didn't even know if I was still on it, in fact. Although I felt broken, I approached the Patient Advocacy Liaison Service, known as PALS, to chase up the referral after two years, 8 months of waiting, because I couldn't cope with talking on the phone and finding out that I wasn't on the list. I eventually got seen out of area at the Leeds Autistic Diagnostic Service, which was what I had requested 3 years earlier to my GP and the CCG, which is the Care Commission, whatever it is, I don't know. It's the people who fund things. But that was rejected at the time, actually. I took my sketchbooks, all 10 of them, to the assessment, because I could show people how I thought through visual images and text. It's always text, always complex. I was diagnosed with autism on the 10th of June 2019, aged 54 years old. This is some of my sketchbooks which I took. It's a way of notation. I find it hard to sit still. I do believe I have ADHD as well, but I don't know if I can face that process of assessment. This is how I research, note take, planning. I also, for example, on the top left, I suffer from hemiplegic migraine and spent 5 days in a stroke unit in Bradford, where I live, which was really traumatic because I couldn't communicate. So I drew this. I managed to draw this. I had my watercolours and my pens, which my family brought me. This is what I presented. Creativity is my voice when I do not have the words. I have no definitions, no barriers, and no limitations with words. They're totally accessible for me. During the pandemic, my reaction to that was to take pictures of all the barriers that I seemed to face, because wearing a mask was very traumatic. It was stifling. I felt like I had a hand over my mouth. I couldn't breathe. This was my response to that. I put text to other text, and because I was a victim of abuse, perhaps smothered, causing PTSD, this felt an activism project and speaking for others, not necessarily myself. Even though you're exempt from wearing a mask, the lanyard is red, which signals danger. Disabled people are identified, and there has been disability hate crime based on the pandemic and the fear around not wearing a mask. Things were barred to me. I use black and white because then I really like using the text, like the typewriter font particularly. Then I decided to use, this is my take on managing my first year of my MA in photography. I used my Playmobil figure, which I named POV, point of view, because I was able to detach my feelings and communicate what was going on for me. I created a book, and using creative processes with unsaid words to be heard within the narrative mechanisms of the autistic brain, because I thought this was one way of dealing with how I felt. So belonging and not belonging. Yes, I took photographs. I found it hilarious, actually. It's like the social distancing guidelines, that's in Hobbycraft, being in Costa. It was one way to communicate what was happening with me. This is my latest work, where I feel, as a person with a hidden disability, I feel like I'm gradually disappearing, and the thought that I feel like I don't exist or I'm invisible, and I'm interested in exploring this. This is just some experimental work that I'm doing in the university and personally. I use my mobile phone for my work because it's accessible and it's part of my agenda, to show that I can even do my dissertation on my phone, which I think is really funny, to do an MA with something so serious on a mobile phone. That's me.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Jo. I can see that we've already got some responses in the chat. So remember, if you have any questions for our artists, just put the questions into the chat or the Q&A box, which you can usually see in the toolbar. So finally, allow me to introduce Claire Cunningham. Claire is a performer and creator of multi-disciplinary performance based near Glasgow. And as one of the UK's most acclaimed and internationally renowned disabled performing artists, Claire's work is often rooted in the study and use/misuse of her crutches and the exploration of the potential of her own specific physicality, with a conscious rejection of traditional dance techniques which are developed for non-disabled bodies. And this runs alongside a deep interest in the lived experience of disability and its implications, not only as a choreographer, but also in terms of societal notions of knowledge, value, connection, and interdependence. Hi. And as a recent artist with Tanzhaus and RW in Düsseldorf, Germany, Claire has also been announced as a recipient as one of Germany's prestigious Tanzpreis Awards, and is also currently an affiliate artist with The Place London.
Thank you. I forgot yet the full bio there. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm going to start my presentation just with a quick self-description, which I try to do in my performances, but also in these environments as well, for partly for people who might have visual impairment, but also just as a practice to introduce and share. So I am a short, white, 44-year-old woman with short, dark brown hair with patches of grey. I have blue eyes with clear rimmed glasses, and today I'm wearing a blue jumper and jeans. I self-identify as disabled and as a CRIP, which is a political and cultural identity around disability. I'm sitting at a desk in my home just outside Glasgow, and visible behind me is a bright orange wall, some books and well, clutter pretty much. And leaning against the wall, maybe you can just see them in the corner, are my 2 grey elbow crutches, which are my constant companions and which I also consider part of my queer quadruped body. I'm a performance maker and choreographer. I trained initially as a singer, but moved into working in theatre as a performer in devised and musical theatre, and then accidentally into dance. After meeting and working with an American non-disabled choreographer, Jess Curtis, I became increasingly interested in my potential in working with movement, and was also then able to train with another American, Bill Shannon, who was a disabled artist who had pioneered his own dance technique using crutches. In fact, I first met Nuala in a workshop that the 2 of us took with Bill near Glasgow many years ago. And from that, I went on to train specifically with Bill, and also began to create my own dance technique and vocabulary. I mention vocabulary particularly here in this context, this festival, because Bill had come from a skateboarding and from breakdance context, and categorizing moves and movements and naming them was very common in that culture, and he encouraged me to do the same. The idea then of owning not only my own movement, but also the language that I use to describe it was then encouraged in me, and is something I have found an interest in as I continue my career as a choreographer. In particular, in noticing how we language our bodies, or indeed when they have been conditioned by others, or sorry, indeed when we have been conditioned by others who have languaged our bodies, and what it means to reclaim that, or indeed to invent new vocabulary for this. A little aside, I'm not sure if languaged is actually a word, or if it is, I'm possibly not using it correctly, but this is maybe a perfect place for someone to suggest a better term for me. In terms of the context in which I'm using the word, let me know. I'm talking about the process of putting language and words to our bodies and movements, something that is more than description. I'd like to share in a moment a short excerpt of a show I made in 2016 with Jess Curtis called The Way You Look at Me Tonight. This excerpt or trailer of the show shows this interest in language, as well as creating landscapes that share my way of navigating space with an audience, and indeed inviting audiences to actively be part of that landscape. This piece also shows you where Jess and I's interest in language crosses over into the realm of what is often referred to now as the aesthetics of access. This clip shares how Jess and I worked a lot with language as a tool to share and widen an audience's experience of what is happening on stage, but also as a tool for visually impaired audience to engage with the physical action, to explore ways that go beyond literal descriptions to play with poetic language and qualities of movement. Alongside our philosopher collaborator's voice, Alvin Noe, who asked questions, also adding to the encounter. This show was a work about perception, and in it we invite our audience to engage with how they create their own perceptions in their body through our senses and through our agency to activate our bodies to obtain information. If you could play the video now, Mabel, that would be great.
We take turns being between the other and the ground.
And my face turns with him.
The floor, the earth.
And his head is now resting on mine.
Is she ticklish?
Gravity holds us together.
I take the weight of his head.
All of us.
Cheek to cheek.
We can move apart, but only a certain amount.
Is his weight on her cheek
and let its weight pass through me out into the floor.
and only in this one dimension.
What are they paying attention to?
We remain in contact.
We turn our bodies gradually, curling away from,
Our attention is in our touch.
then into each other like a
I feel her body.
peaceful, silent swastika.
I feel when it welcomes mine and when it says no.
Is it possible for them to blot me out?
Of breath and bare feet,
Not now.
turning slowly around.
Not there.
Is it possible to blot an audience out?
Try over here.
When I reach my hand for
Go
him,
back.
I find him
Let's go back to you.
Why would you want
and then past
to
him,
do that?
My turn to go.
Reaching
Isn't it
with
all
hands
My
about the
turn to
audience?
take
out
away.
into the air.
What questions are they asking?
Thanks, Mabel. Thank you. So part of my journey as a dancer and then as a maker has been to recognise the specificity of my body and how it moves through the world, and in particular in relation to the world. So for example, beginning to work in dance and being encouraged to raise my head so that people could see my face. This is certainly something I understood from having trained initially as a singer. But as a singer, I stood still. I had revelled in the confidence that singing gave me to look people in the eye. But when moving, my eyes needed to survey the ground. I could have no confidence in moving if I didn't look to see where my crutches were being placed. So I began to recognise a correlation between my vision and my crutches. And by recognising this, I began to own it as a quality, a trademark of my movement vocabulary. And if I know it, I can use it. So I begin to make work that uses and platforms my skill in surveying and traversing the ground, making landscapes for me or indeed my audience that draw their attention also to the ground. And beginning to shift the focus from the upright body or from normative ideas of speed to ways of taking time, to navigating, to valuing ground as an interesting terrain rather than simply a base on which to stand on or jump or dance from. This way of thinking, of recognising what the lived experience of disability offers me, and a shift in thinking away from disability as something that others perceived me as, to embracing it as actually what shapes how I perceive the world, has been the foundation for my artistic work. My work has been to continue to study and to analyse how I move through the world, to understand that the lived experience of disability shapes my relationship to environment, to time, and to people, and my choices, therefore, in how I navigate the world, in the choreography of moving and being, in taking the time to notice what I notice and to appreciate that is unique to me, and yet also to revel in the shared experiences, particularly with other disabled folks, of recognising what my colleague, Julia Watts-Belser, names crip expertise, and building performances around it and welcoming audiences into our world. I prioritise the experience of disabled, deaf, visually impaired, chronically ill, and neurodiverse folks in my shows, in the welcoming of those individuals into my performances, in the work of trying to make the experience as rich as possible, and not simply a version of the work offered through a different medium. And by attending to how these communities might experience my work shapes the very work itself. And this is what excites me. It influences what form it takes, the space I choose to perform in, the time things take, the seating choices, the layout, the design of a room, and the very material of the work itself. All audience members are welcome, of course, but by prioritising these lived experiences, my hope and intention is that we also create a richer encounter for everyone who comes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire, for that extremely rich and insightful presentation. And thank you, Jill. And thank you, Nuala, as well, for 3 just wonderfully thought-provoking and generous presentations about your art and your creative practices. So Samira and I will chair this question and answer session now for the time that remains to us, and we have some questions of our own to start off with, but I want to just encourage our audience to please put their questions, any questions that you may have that you would like to put to one of our artists, or indeed all of them, to please put those into the question and answer box or into the chat, where Samira and I will find them and bring them to our 3 speakers today. But to begin, perhaps a first question that Samira and I would like to ask all 3 of you, Claire, Nuala and Jill, is when and how did you begin your creative practices? When did dance, poetry, artwork enter your lives? Was it always there?
Do either of you want to go first?
No, you're welcome, Nuala, from my point of view.
I think poetry was always there, because I always enjoyed the relationship between meaning and sound patterns, and I still do. And as I said, I imagine poetry as a long conversation between all the people who have thought using poems. But as I got older, I started to realise that there weren't very many people like me in poetry. And the disabled people I could see tended to be there as symbols of incapacity. They tended to be there as props to allow a non-disabled speaker to have an epiphany. And I'm not a prop, I'm a person. So I started writing poems around that, you know, to demonstrate, because I think disability has been insufficiently imagined. And so I wrote poems in which it's part of a rounded life, but not just an overwhelming symbol. It's quite startling to find that the art form you love contains nothing like you.
Thank you, Nuala. Jill, would you like to come in on that question, please?
Yeah, I was trying to identify when I think it was as a kid, and to be honest, I used to make cardboard box rooms with Action Man in. I love doing that with little posters and total different, you know, I liked environments. I had quite a collection until my mum did sort of point out that we didn't really have the room, and I was bereft that they had to go. But yeah, I was quite attached with things like that, and it was just almost an absolute need to draw, to doodle, to do something. And I got in trouble at school because I used to steal the sketchbook, not the sketchbooks, the exercise books from the unlocked store cupboard. And I used to write incessantly. I could read and write before I went to school, but I used to rewrite films and TV programs with me in them. So I suppose that was probably my earliest, but I've always done it. I've always done something creative. It depends on the situation rather than the medium.
Thank you, Jill.
Wow, it's hard to always find a short version of this, because you realize that, yeah, like they're lifelong sort of things, and you only sort of recognize sometimes the traces of it a lot later, I think. I realized that I had actually tried to do dance as a child. There are photos that exist of me doing ballet as like a 5 or 6 year old. I don't actually have any memory of doing it, but there are photos of me and my dad in the living room trying to do like ballet routines. That I remember doing shows for the family, but I don't remember being in the class very much. And I only had a sort of flashback to it when I suddenly found myself in a class like at 27 or 28, and somebody started doing ballet. I was like, wait a minute, I think I did this. And to the family's remembrance is really that it came to a point that I couldn't, in inverted commas, keep up with what was happening in the class when I was about 5 or 6. And so I had to stop because I couldn't do what was being expected, let's say. And I had no sort of relationship with dance whatsoever for a long, long time. And it was something I was not remotely interested in. I saw no connection to it. I had seen it. The funny thing was I saw Bill Shannon perform, who's this dancer on crutches. But by that point, I had really become a singer. Singing was the thing that really felt like is in my soul, first of all, is that I'm a singer. And I would see Bill Shannon perform, but I was like, wow, that's amazing. He's a dancer, I'm a singer. It still didn't register with me as something that I wanted to do. But I had a sort of quite mercenary sort of period, I would say. Well, also I hit that 27 coming up on 30 sort of period where you start going, oh, am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing? I knew I wanted to be a performer. I wasn't earning a living just trying to be a singer. It wasn't realistic. So I began to look at other skills to add to be a performer, not just a singer. And I had a sort of strange sort of realization that perhaps I could do aerial work because so like trapeze or rope work, because I had a lot of upper body strength from the crutches. And so I began to sort of learn a bit about doing aerial work, but didn't sort of correlate that as dance. But it was really by starting to do aerial work, which falls under circus really, that I kind of got accidentally sort of shifted into working in dance. But yeah, there's lots of little things that sort of led into it at the time that I didn't quite realize was going on. But yeah, it turns out it was there very early on in my life. And ballet, of all things, which I find highly offensive now, if I have to be honest with you. So, but apparently I did want to do it at one stage.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, that's thank you all for your responses. There are a couple of questions that have come in. I've got, so I will pass over to those, perhaps take them in the order that they came in. So the first question came in from Sarah and asks Nuala, it observes, it says, it's a question for you, Nuala. It says, the early section of your presentation reminded me of ways that autistic characteristics can be described using visual impairment as a metaphor, perhaps in relation to how we perceive contexts or minds, for examples. So that was the observation to Nuala, but then I think the question is for all three of our artists. I wonder if any of you have found alternative pockets of good practice or creative response which doesn't rely on this unhelpful strategy.
I think that it's the application of the idea of blindness to autistic characters is an example of how pervasive ideas of blindness as incapacity are, and it's just an example of how much how much ableist language and how many ableist assumptions we have, even as disabled artists. So you just have to be super conscious of that, and try to avoid using that kind of language, but be aware that it's everywhere, and even as a disabled artist you will have acquired some of it. Does that help?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Nuala. Yeah. Jill, would you like to come in on that question?
I think of myself primarily as an artist who happens to have a disability personally, and it's just, in retrospect I can apply it because I was diagnosed so late, but I do find it, I don't even understand the question, if I'm honest. It's only when Nuala was speaking that I sort of got a bit of a gist of what was. I find I was trying to process the question. I'm really sorry, but that was I didn't understand it.
That's absolutely fine. I think I was reading recently about a trait, and I found that this was, if I'm correct in thinking this might be an example of the phenomenon Sarah's describing, but I was reading about a concept that's called time blindness, for example, and I was struck by this kind of example of ableist language in describing a different relationship to time, you know, in people with, I think that was when I was reading about the symptoms of ADHD, but so I think that may be the kind of example of terminology that might be the sort of thing that our questioner here is asking about, and just how there could be other ways of describing the relationship to time, for example, of a person who has autism.
I think it depends what model you come from. If it's a medical model, which is what you're diagnosed with, alongside the social model of disability, you know, I'm disabled because of society. I'm, you know, where things are incredibly stressful because environments are stressful, and there's challenges put in place, and it's just because, you know, when you start a sentence and you're not sure how to finish it. Next.
Absolutely.
Next. I'm going to mute now because I have no idea what I'm talking about now. All right.
Thank
anyway,
you.
Let's go, Claire. Go.
Well, I don't really know what I'm talking about either. I think, yeah, I think, like, yeah, I also sort of recognize a lot in what Nuala said about this thing of, like, we are all conditioned. We all grow up as ableist, and even as disabled people, we are conditioned with language and aesthetics of the world. And yeah, I think it's a lifelong journey of unlearning and learning to notice, whether that's ableism or racism or misogyny, all of these things, fat prejudice, all of these things are programmed into our language, especially. And yeah, I think one, we have to learn, it's a slow process of learning to recognize it, and then just habitually trying to teach ourselves to change that language. Yeah, like I perpetually sort of notice, yeah, exactly, like this use of metaphor of, like, blindness being used often as a symbol for a metaphor for ignorance, you know, and you think, oh, well, I know that the person who's using this has never met many blind or visually impaired people, or they wouldn't use this metaphor. You know, there's lots of things in language: paralyzed by fear, crippled by doubt, all of these terms that are really, it just very it's also the realization that they're just very poor and simplistic use of language. Like it doesn't really say the thing that actually the person is probably trying to get to. And just, yeah, gradually learning to sort of unpick those things and not continue the habit, I guess, is the thing that I tried to do. You know, I made a show recently, which is built around working with professional Elvis Presley tribute artists. And so at one point in the show, the song Always on My Mind is sort of sung in quite a sort of open way, but it has a line about blindness somewhere in it as well. And it's like, okay, well, we just change. In this show, we don't sing that. There's no way we're using that line. So we change the line, you know, and you just try to teach yourself to recognize it. But yeah, our language particularly is peppered with all of this stuff. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Claire. Thanks, Jill. Thanks, Nuala, for responding to that first question from Sarah. There's a second question from an anonymous attendee who asks, when you apply for funding, how or who do you get support if needed from? Sorry, how or who do you get support from with application processes if needed? Is that something you have experience of, any of you? Perhaps that's not relevant. I
mean, I can start. I'm very fortunate and quite unusual as a freelance performance artist in that I have a producer. I've been very fortunate to have a producer for quite a long time. So, so they tend to be, I guess, in my case, quite often the person that's doing the application form now. But at the beginning of my work, I was mostly doing my own funding applications. But I would tend to sort of always go around a bunch of friends or colleagues to sort of help put that together. I'm very fortunate also that I've been pretty well supported by Creative Scotland, and most of the times I've been able to kind of have dialogue with them. I know there's been sometimes periods where there's been really weird setups where they're not allowed to actually talk with the people that are applying. I know there's been periods where that's been really, really bad. I think luckily in dance, we've had really great people in that department in Creative Scotland who've always been very supportive and up for dialogue and actually interested in getting people support. So I think it also partly will depend on what art form you're working in. So yeah, I think in terms of like applying for funding, that's probably been my sort of experience so far.
Thanks, Claire. Jill, I see you have your hand up. Would you like to come in at this point?
I hope you don't mind, Nuala. Yeah, the reason I'm really annoyed about the funding applications, for example, I wanted to get assistance to apply for developing your creative practice, the Arts Council, and I had to identify needs and everything. I needed support to access support so I could apply, and it was just like bloody bonkers. And I missed the deadline because I couldn't get my act together, and it was just too stressful. It's a very linear process, and I've got to try and quantify and put things in spaces that I don't know how to define it, and it just did my head in. And so I just don't have any funding at all. So that's why I use my mobile phone, because, and I'm also in debt because I did get a nice camera, but you know, thank goodness for PayPal credit, eh?
I don't think this question is very relevant to me, or at least is not currently relevant to me. There may be a magic day when I'm getting funding from Creative Scotland, but at the moment that's just not something that features in my life. It might one day.
Thanks, Nuala. Thanks, Jill. Thanks, Claire. Samira, would you like to choose among the other questions that we had ready? Because perhaps if you'd like to come in and choose.
Yeah, I think there's a new question in the Q&A box, actually. Let me read it. It says, what do you think would need to happen in primary or secondary education settings to make a real difference to your early experiences, and what could be done to make these environments really inclusive?
They could stop setting ableist poems at standard grade. Sorry for jumping in, but I think that what we were saying earlier about ableist language being kind of everywhere, there are poems that get set at standard grade and higher, including Norman McCaig, Assisi, in the Snack Bar by Edwin Morgan, which rely heavily on ableist language and portrayals of disability that aren't really very positive at all. And there is currently no discussion on why that's a problem. So if, as a disabled student, you come across these poems and they are being taught in class and nobody is discussing why they might be a problem, that's going to teach you particular things about how valuable you are or aren't. I remember looking up Scottish Poetry Library advice on how to teach in the Snack Bar, and this may have changed, it may have changed, but when I looked it up, there was no discussion of the fact that it was ableist. So I think that one of the things they could do is stop setting these texts, and if they feel a desperate need to set them, they can at least have a more open discussion about the problems with them. But for example, Edwin Morgan has many wonderful poems. Can we choose one that's a bit better? Sorry, rant, but I think that would have made a difference.
Thank you, Nuala. Yeah, I think that's absolutely, I totally agree. Would Jill or Claire, would you like to come in on that question that was posted in the Q&A box by Joe Fox? Thanks, Joe, for your question.
Yeah, I would like, it's having role models, and whatever sort of situation. And I remember being sort of 5'9" and not feeling a part of it, or not identifying. I was quite androgynous. Well, I wasn't. I am in as a young person, and it was what changed for me was reading Maya Angelou's poem about, Still I Rise and Phenomenal Woman back in the early 80s. And that was life-changing for me because she was tall, and that really helped me. But as far as autism is concerned, there's nothing really, even in modern day curricula, I don't think there is, where any sort of disabled person, disabled poet or artist or anything isn't really put up as a role model. So you do feel quite isolated.
Yeah, I think I can only sort of partly, so it's second or third everything that's gone before. I think the biggest issue is that ableism is something that is just really not understood or recognised by the vast majority of society. It's just not seen as it's not recognised, like that this language is in there. Or I think, like we're now seeing, particularly in this last year, there's been a brilliant amount of sort of attention, particularly since last summer, on sort of systemic racism and how that's built into everything. But I think there isn't we're not anywhere close to society understanding that ableism is is structural as well. It's working in the same ways. It's a different experience, but it's the same systems of oppression and how it's baked into everything. And in fact, the two things are intrinsically linked. Racism is also ableism, because it's about notions of superiority, and it's linked into colonialism and eugenics. It's all part of ableism. But I think, yeah, exactly, like for me, this issue of role models, I mean, I don't think I did dance in school. Like, I was that typical Scottish school where the only bit of dance you got was the Ceilidh dancing once a year or something. And I was made to work the recorder. That was my role, was to work the stop and start the music, you know, or I sat in the teacher's car as we drove out to watch people play hockey on the fields. Like, that was my integrated education, you know, was, you know, sitting in the PE teacher's car with, you know, watching people. I would like to think that that's probably hopefully changed now, but I genuinely don't have a clue. I'm not particularly linked into education, I must admit. I've chosen to sort of make my focus in sort of professional arts environments and train sort of and training sort of disabled artists, but I don't tend to have a lot of experience with kids or teenagers. I think, yeah, there's a lot of people that are really good at that, and I sort of tend to sort of be like, you work with the people that are really good. So I tend to work with sort of older individuals, but yeah, I would hope that things might be a bit better. But I think, yeah, there's a real lack of role models of seeing and being and working with and alongside different bodies and different ways of being. And I think as long as we have educational systems that are built on comparing one person with another and creating hierarchical forms of assessment, then you're always going to, you're always going to destroy a bunch of lives and segregate a bunch of people.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying. Thank you, Jill, and thank you, Nuala, for your wonderful insights and important recommendations for how education could be changed, for giving us this generous look into your creative practices and philosophy, and just giving us a taste of the beautiful work that you have created and continue to create. So we are extremely grateful to you, to all three of you, for being with us today. I'm conscious that the clock is against us. I'd love to stay and ask you loads more questions, but I don't want to trespass on your Sunday afternoon. So it just remains for me to, on behalf of myself and Samira, to thank the media services team, the events team, and the WayWORD Festival folk for making all of this possible, as well as you are wonderful artists, of course. Thanks again to Creative Scotland and to the University of Aberdeen for funding this event. Thank you to our audience members for coming along. We hope that you've, I want to hand over here to Samira, actually, sorry, to say these final words.
That's okay. We would just like to thank the audience for coming, and we hope you've all enjoyed it as much as we did. And just to let you know, there are a few more events still running today, so make sure to sign up for them. And if you want to stay updated about future events or festivals, follow us on social media. Our handle is @WayWORDABDN. And thank you again to Claire, Nuala, and Jill for joining us today, and we hope you have a great Sunday.